On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the promise that had anchored the world's money for a generation, the guarantee that a dollar could always be turned into a fixed weight of gold. Less than 3 years later, in a series of meetings between American and Saudi officials that were never called a treaty and never put to a public vote, a different arrangement gave the newly unanchored dollar somewhere else to stand. This is the story of how that arrangement came together, what each side actually received from it, and why a mechanism built in a handful of private meetings still moves more of the world's money than most. Imagine one secret handshake, one meeting, one signature, and then it was done. The record shows something messier, and in a way more unsettling. A crisis nobody in Washington had planned, a diplomat crossing continents to broker a ceasefire, and a financial arrangement that grew out of that same crossing almost as an afterthought. Start with what had just broken. For nearly 3 decades, the value of the dollar had been tied, at least on paper, to a fixed weight of gold, $35 an ounce. Nixon's August 1971 announcement ended that link unilaterally, with none of the other governments that depended on it consulted beforehand. The dollar could now float. It could also, in theory, simply be worth less to everyone holding it, unless something else gave the rest of the world a reason to keep wanting it. That reason arrived through a crisis nobody in Washington had engineered. During the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the Arab members of OPEC imposed an embargo against to resupply the Israeli military. Oil prices spiked, and the country that had just walked away from the gold standard discovered, within months, how much of its own economy depended on nations it had spent very little time courting. The embargo was lifted in March 1974, after the United States pressured Israel into negotiating with Syria over the Golan Heights. Getting there took Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, moving between capitals that would not speak to each other directly. Kissinger did not stop at ending the immediate crisis. He also proposed what became the International Energy Agency, a coalition of oil-consuming nations built to coordinate a response if an embargo like 1973's ever happened again. It was, in effect, an insurance policy against the exact scenario Saudi Arabia and its neighbors had just demonstrated they could trigger, a coordinated cutoff of oil to any country whose foreign policy they opposed. 3 months after the embargo lifted, Washington and Riyadh signed a wide-ranging agreement on expanded economic and military cooperation. In the 1975 fiscal year alone, the two countries signed $2 billion worth of military contracts, including an agreement to send Saudi Arabia 60 fighter jets. But the part of the arrangement that would outlast every fighter jet was smaller, quieter, and entirely financial. A key part of the agreement was for Saudi Arabia to price its oil in dollars, and to invest billions of those dollars back into United States Treasury notes. For Saudi Arabia, the calculation was simpler than it looked. The kingdom, in a region reshaped by war only months earlier, and a security guarantee from the world's most powerful military, was worth more than any single financial term written into the same agreement. Put plainly, the exchange came down to this. According to the historical record, Nixon and Kissinger, in a series of meetings with the Saudi royal family, agreed that the United States would provide military protection for Saudi Arabia's oil fields. In return, Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in United States dollars. Why did an American administration need a kingdom on the other side of the world to keep pricing its most valuable export in a currency it no longer backed with gold? Because a currency that nobody is required to hold is a currency that can quietly lose its importance. Historians describe Nixon and Kissinger as concerned that abandoning the gold standard, combined with a growing American trade deficit and the debt piling up from the Vietnam War, would cause a decline in the world's underlying demand for the dollar. Oil solved that problem in the most direct way available. You could not buy the world's most essential traded commodity without dollars in hand, which meant every country that needed oil now needed dollars first. That same year, the two governments moved to formalize the relationship beyond a single agreement. The United States-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation was established on the heels of the Arab oil embargo and the price increases that came with it, built specifically to foster closer political ties between the two countries. Its structure was deliberately balanced rather than one-sided. The United States Secretary of the Treasury and the Saudi Minister of Finance and Economy served as co-chairmen, meeting as equals on paper rather than as a patron and a client. None of this sounds dramatic on paper. A joint commission, co-chairman, fiscal year contracts. But behind that bureaucratic language sat one of the quietest and largest transfers of financial influence of the 20th century, and it never needed a single headline to get started. There is a term for what happened next to the money moving through that arrangement, and it did not come from inside either government. The word petrodollar was coined in 1973, credited to the Egyptian-American economist Ibrahim Owais and, separately, to former United States Secretary of Commerce Peter G. Peterson. Petrodollar recycling described a simple mechanical fact. Oil-exporting nations were now earning more dollars from oil sales than they could spend or invest inside their own economies, and that surplus had to go somewhere. In practice, a great deal of it went back into American government debt, the same Treasury notes named in the 1974 agreement, which let Washington just spent a war and an oil shock trying to protect. The scale of that recycling is easy to state and hard to fully absorb. From 1974 through 1981 alone, the combined current account surplus of every OPEC member nation came to $450 billion. Decades later, the same mechanism was still running at a far larger scale. OPEC's combined revenues approximated $1 trillion a year in 2008, and again in the years from 2011 through 2014. Money moving at that scale does not simply sit in a vault somewhere. It buys government bonds, it buys real estate, it buys defense contracts and diplomatic goodwill, and once it is woven into a financial system that size, unwinding it becomes almost as consequential an act as building it was in the first place. Compare that to how most people encounter this fact today. Nobody votes on why oil is priced in dollars rather than any other currency. It shows up as a background assumption of the global economy, taught as though it had simply always been true, when in fact it was arranged a very specific problem in a very specific year. Here is the paradox worth sitting with. The United States had just spent 1971 unilaterally tearing up an international commitment, walking away from the promise that a dollar meant a fixed amount of gold, with none of the other governments that had built that system consulted beforehand. Within 3 years, the same country was building a brand new foundation for that same currency, through quiet diplomacy with a single kingdom, again without the arrangement ever being called a treaty or debated in public the way one would be. The method was the same both times, even though the outcome looked opposite. Something that anchors the entire global financial system was decided by a small number of people in a small number of rooms, and the rest of the world adjusted to it afterward, whether or not it had been consulted. These two stories sit next to each other for a reason. The last episode showed what happens when a fixed system finally breaks under its own weight. This one shows what a government does in the years right after that kind of break. It does not simply let a currency float and hope for one relationship and one transaction at a time. And the arrangement held. Since the agreement signed in the early to mid-1970s, OPEC oil has generally been quoted in United States dollars. Every barrel priced that way functions as a small, continuous vote for the dollar's importance, cast by exporters and importers who never formally agreed to cast it. It became the default simply because, once enough of the world's oil trade ran through dollars, no single country had an easy reason to be the first to switch to the same underlying question. Who gets to make the decision everyone else has to live with? Sometimes it is one boardroom deciding alone. This time it was two governments, meeting quietly, solving a problem neither one wanted to admit having, and building something that outlived every person who sat in the room. One note before we close. This is a historical account built from public agency records, encyclopedic sources, and the documented positions of the governments involved. It is not a claim about any individual's private motives beyond what the historical record itself attributes to them, and it is not investment advice or a claim about current policy. So here is the question worth leaving in the comments. When the foundation of a currency can be rebuilt through a series of private meetings, never called a treaty and never put to a public vote, who actually decides what money is worth? The country printing it or the country that agrees to keep pricing something essential in it? And in the next episode, we go back to a much smaller room. A Stanford dropout still barely out of her teens situation on a machine that promised fast, accurate blood tests from only a small sample. It took federal investigators more than a decade to catch up with the claim that it never worked. That story is next.